Hi everybody, this is Biz Gormley calling in from EPIP National. We are getting ready to start today's Wednesday webinar. We're really excited for today's topic, Grantmaking for Equity. Give us just about 5 more seconds and then I'm going to launch my slides and we'll get started. All right, so my slides should be popping up on your screen. If you can't see them, please just go ahead and let me know in the chat, in the question box. Welcome to today's EPIP Wednesday webinar, Grantmaking for Equity. We are really thrilled to have a collection of folks who are from the Bay Area Justice Funders Network and been participating in their programs. And we are welcoming Rachel Humphrey, Cassandra Zawilski, Jake Mogan, I'm sorry I misspelled your name, and Jazmin Segura for today's webinar. I'm going to go a little bit over who EPIP is and a couple housekeeping notes before we jump into the content. If you're new to EPIP, welcome. And if you're coming back and have been here before, welcome back. For those who would benefit from learning more about who we are, just to share quickly, EPIP is, we stand for Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, and we are a national network of foundation professionals, social entrepreneurs, and other change makers who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. And we do that by providing a platform for our community to connect with each other, learn and practice leadership skills, and inspire emerging ideas in the social sector. Our mission is to cultivate and activate leaders in order to advance equity through philanthropy. And we are based nationally in New York and Phoenix, and then we have chapters in 15 locations across the country. So if you're new and you'd like to learn more about EPIP or how to get involved as a member or any opportunities in your local area, please feel free to email me, biz, @epip.org, so I can answer any of your questions. I look forward to hearing from you. I just wanted to give you a quick update on some upcoming events. The first is our next EPIP webinar, which is going to be on Wednesday, May 10 at 3 p.m. Eastern. It's going to be focused on investment and transformative finance. So learning more about what the investing side of foundations do, what transformational finance looks like, and giving folks a chance to both get that 101 terminology and orientation, as well as dig into a little bit of the different ways that impact investing and transformative finance are already in play in the market. You can sign up for that event and any of the other local chapter events and national events at epip.org/events. And we wanted to flag also some exciting opportunities for our annual conference, which this year will be at the Unity Summit in connection with Change Philanthropy Coalition. It's September 18 to 21 in New Orleans, and registration will be going live soon. But in the meantime, we wanted to give you the website, changeunitysummit.org, to check it out and flag that the session submissions for the call for sessions are being accepted through May 1st. We actually have a webinar this Friday, if you want to brainstorm ideas or learn more from Tamir, our executive director, about tips from our side about your session submissions. So if you have questions about any of that, again, feel free to email me, biz@epip.org. Some housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, please use the question box. We are going to ask that if you have technical issues or difficulties that you're running into, please just drop a note into the question box so that we can support you on that. If you have any comments or questions that are about the content, please also put a section in that. Each of our presenters is going to take some time to dig in on a specific element of today's presentation. And so just to go ahead and type your questions up as they emerge for you, and that way we'll be able to go back to the group at the end of your questions and moderate the Q&A period there. At the end of my introduction, we're going to do a quick poll. The polls are anonymous, and if you would like your questions to be anonymous as well, just go ahead and put an asterisk on your question and we will leave your name out. We are going to be recording today's webinar. Excuse me. So You will be able to get it on the archive probably by the end of the week is usually when we're able to get them up. If you'd like to join the the conversation on social media, you can use the EPIP webinar hashtag, and I believe there's a couple other hashtags that are relevant to the content that will be presented in just a minute. At the end, a survey is going to pop up. It's just a few questions, but if you can take a moment to complete it, give us a sense of how the content in this webinar met your expectations. If there are other things you'd like to learn about in future webinars, we'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speakers. Rachel is coming to us today from Bay Area Justice Funders Network. Cassandra is one of our chapter leaders, EPIP Bay Area co-chair, and is formerly of the McKenzie Foundation. Jake Mogan is at the 11th Hour Project, and Jazmin Segura is from the San Francisco Foundation. We're going to be able to share more about their bios in detail on the website when we put up the archive. But for now, we'd love to learn more about you. So I'm actually going to launch our first poll, which is a question about how long you've been working in philanthropy. So if you can take a moment to fill out this survey, click whichever of the options is most relevant to you, best fit for you. And I'll leave it up for about 30 seconds just to see if we can get as many of your votes as possible. Great. If there's a couple more folks who want to vote, I'm going to leave it open 5 more seconds and then we'll close it out. Great. So it looks like majority of folks are between 2 and 5 years in the sector of philanthropy. 20% of us on the call today are, well, around 20% are in the first, between year one and year 2. Over 5 years, about 23% of the group, and I'm in my first year, 10%. Welcome. Now we'd love to learn just a little bit more about which of these descriptions of an organization best matches your employer. If you can please click whichever of these is most relevant to you. Great, about 5 more seconds if anyone else would like to vote. All right, looks like the majority of folks are at a small to medium-sized foundation. Split next in line is between folks who work at large foundations and philanthropic advisory firms. 13% of our group today is calling in from a nonprofit, and 6% are from a different kind of organization not described here. And one more quick poll, if you are working at a funding organization, if you could give us a sense of your grant making budget, this will help us tailor today's content to best meet your needs. All right, about 2 more seconds if anyone else wants to vote. And it looks like a majority of folks, well, 42%, 25 million and above, 21%, 5 to 25 million, 17%, 1 to 5 million, 13% between 25,000 and 1 million, 250,000, excuse me, and 1 million, and 8% 0 to 250,000. Great, that's really helpful. Thank you guys for your feedback. We'll look forward to your questions and getting you guys more engaged through those as we go along. If you have questions or issues, just type them in. And in the meantime, I'm going to pass it over to Rachel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Biz. And thank you so much to EPIP for organizing this webinar and for the chance to work together. I know we've been friends and fans of EPIP for a long time, so it's great to be able to do this together. Thanks also to our wonderful presenters, our members of the Harmony cohort who were willing to join us. So really grateful for your time. I wanted to do just a quick overview of kind of the purpose and outcomes and process of the webinar. We fondly call it the POP. Our purpose is to explore tensions and questions in doing grant making for equity. And grant making for equity can mean a lot of different things. So to get the chance to learn from folks who have been doing it. So the outcomes are that you get to hear from 3 grant makers, their experience in conducting values-aligned grant-making practices. And here at Bay Area Justice Funders Network, we sort of pride ourselves in being able to have the real talk. So to hear the real experience, not the necessarily shiny version. The other outcome is that all of the participants will have a chance to learn a little bit about our choir book, which is the framework for social justice philanthropy, as well as our Harmony initiative as supports for practice shifts that are more towards justice and equity. So we'll actually start with a little bit of that for the agenda. I'll move through it pretty quickly so we can spend the majority of our time on these case study presentations and allowing enough time for some of your questions. So that is the plan. All right, so first just a little bit about the Bay Area Justice Funders Network. We are a network of 25 institutions and 20 individuals all working to help advance a justice agenda and to strengthen grant making for social justice movements in the Bay Area and beyond. We offer a wide range of programs from webinars and other shorter events local to the Bay Area, as well as customized consulting, and then the substantive 10-month leadership development program called the Harmony Initiative. We also provide thought leadership through different blogs and reports and conduct coordination work for different funder collaborations. And one of our most recent thought pieces is called the choir book, and I wanted to spend some time just going over the components of that as a frame for hearing our case studies. So the choir book was created to help really any foundation, regardless of size or shape or orientation, to be able to strengthen its approach to grant making to be in better alignment with social justice values and to better support equity and justice in their work. Just a quick note to say, I'm sure you're wondering why we called it the choir book. So I want to tell that story briefly. And you probably have heard this a lot, but in our work, we've heard over and over from both philanthropic and movement peers, oh, we've got to get beyond the choir, we've got to get beyond the choir. And we heard it so often that it really made us question, like, wait, well, do we really have a choir? So in our opinion, when we reflected on that, we feel like in philanthropy and even in the smaller circle of social justice philanthropy, we have a lot of absolutely fantastic soloists, but we don't really have that choir. And at the same time, when we were thinking about what we could offer to the field in this regard, we saw how much we really need a philanthropic choir to be able to address the intense issues of our time in any sort of real way. And of course, in recent months, that need has only intensified. So that's a little bit of the background behind why we created the choir book and why we called it that. Now let's go to the next slide, just break down some of the components of the framework. So, and the framework is available on our website, so please do check that out and we can put that in the chat box. So the overview of the framework is, first of all, there's the values, and then competencies, which is the individual competencies that any good grant maker holds, and then the practices within each step of the grant cycle. So we'll go to the next slide to define what these 3 different components are. So values are really the foundation of the framework. In the print publication and also on the version you can see on our website, you'll notice that the values bar is visible regardless of which page you're on within the framework. And that was a design choice to indicate just how important the values are and to have them always in front. So we defined, based on our field research, and our literature review and interviews, the following sets of guiding values that we believe good social justice funders keep in mind. And we paired them to create richer, more nuanced meaning for our work. Given how important they are, I'm actually going to go ahead and read them out. So for dignity and equity, this is about the belief that all people deserve equal rights and access, the dignity of self-determination, and the agency to shape the decisions that impact their lives. Integrity and authenticity, this is striving to live and act consistently in accordance with values and working to be conscious of both personal growth edges and systemic constraints in a genuine, truthful, and transparent manner. Next is solidarity and collectivity, which is seeking to be effective and humble partners, allies, and champions with and for communities with an ecosystem view and a collaborative approach. And then lastly is courage and responsibility, which is taking personal responsibility to leverage our access, skills, and power to benefit others, and taking risks, both to try unproven approaches and to speak truth to power. So obviously those are pretty dense. I'd encourage you to spend some time with them. We packed a lot in there. But we see those values as so foundational, as I said. So the next component for the framework, you can move to the next slide, is the competencies. So when we look at excellent social justice philanthropic practice, we see individual grant makers displaying 6 core competencies that they really rely on to be effective in their grant making. And so this is analytical, leadership, strategic, technical, adaptive, and relational competence. And in the framework, we provide sort of a standard definition of what that means, and then we offer an additional clarification of what that means in a justice funder context. So for example, our definition for analytical competence includes the ability to understand the forces and structures that contribute to injustice, the repercussions of oppression on broad classes of people, and how power is distributed. So you can forward to the next slide just for a quick look at all 6 of those competencies. And then let's go on to the next, which is the third component of the framework. So this is really about the practices to support the application of the values and these competencies within a grant-making portfolio or within a grant-making institution. We've structured the framework to follow the 6 primary grant-making stages. So most grant-making institutions, kind of regardless of focus, size, et cetera, do something that looks like this in terms of starting with strategy development, moving to outreach and application, through due diligence, making the case to the decision makers, and then making the awards, implementing the grants, and doing some form of evaluation and learning. So by looking at each of these individual steps, we could get really specific about what does practice look like, what's different in the foundations that are really aligning their grant-making work with social justice values and with equity. So in the framework, we work from a place of inquiry, and we ask funders to consider key questions for each stage of the grant cycle as opposed to a list of do's and don'ts, because we really understand that each foundation has very different context and capacities. And so in some ways, a really great question is more important than the list of do's and don'ts. And in the Harmony Initiative, the 10-month leadership development program that we offer, we go further in detail by exploring the specific behaviors and practices that we've learned about and observed at each step of the grant cycle that are aligned with each of the 6 individual competencies. So next slide. So knowing that good social justice grant making happens in all of the small moves as well as in the big flashy changes, we wanted to highlight this concept of the transitional practice versus a transformational practice. So in the framework, we've identified the transitional practice as an improvement on traditional philanthropic practice that's better aligned with equity and social justice. And a transformational practice is a more radical change to standard philanthropy that really strongly supports justice and equity and is highly values aligned. So not to say that one is better than the other, but rather that change is possible for everyone, regardless of our positional power, years in the sector, type of institution. You can always be looking for the transitional practices and then the openings for the times where you can push a more transformational practice. So Cassie, Jake, and Jazmin, who we'll be hearing from next, are all members of the current cohort of the Harmony Initiative. So they have been steeped in these concepts since September of last year. And we have asked each of them to share some examples from their work where they've applied some of the concepts from this framework to their work in their foundation, and to share the real story, including the stumbles and the struggles and the questions not yet answered. So hopefully we'll hear a bit about what values they personally brought to the work and their institutions use to guide the work, and how that translated into day-to-day questioning and decision-making. And a little bit, and a lot of this, it's a little bit early to know, but we want to hear kind of what the early lessons are. So with that, I will pass the speaking baton over to Cassie, and I'll ask everybody to share whatever you think is relevant from your bio, and then, as we know, folks will have a chance to read everyone's full bios in the recording. So, all right, Cassie.
Hey everyone, this is Cassie. I'm EPIP Bay Area co-chair, and I was most recently a program associate with the McKenzie Foundation of San Francisco for the last 3 years. So I'm going to share a little bit about how our small family foundation incorporated equity into our application process. I'm going to go into a little bit about our values, how we integrate those values into our practice, briefly the results of that, and then some of the lessons learned. So McKenzie Foundation is a small family foundation. We have a budget of under $500,000. Since we were a very young organization, and when I came on board, we didn't have a structure or a strategic grant-making program. My coworker G. Roman and I were tasked with developing the strategy and designing the grant-making program in youth mental health. And so even though we didn't come from the nonprofit sector and didn't have that nonprofit grant-seeking experience, our marginalized identities and our lived experiences had a major influence on incorporating a social justice framework into our grant-making. So we thought our dollars would have the most impact on small community-based organizations that were focused on systemic change, either through youth advocacy, youth organizing, leadership development, media and communications, or supporting convenings and collaboration. And we were very cognizant of the role of systems of oppression on young people, so we prioritized youth that were impacted by racism, classism, heterosexism, transphobia, trauma, or youth who are involved in systems such as child welfare or juvenile justice. Next slide. So some of the values that we incorporate into our work were cultural humility, curiosity, relationship building, and equity via targeted universalism. So humility, specifically cultural humility, is this concept that was coined in the 90s to address multiculturalism in healthcare settings, but we saw as applicable elsewhere. So it's essentially this philosophy for engaging in this lifelong commitment and process of self-evaluation and really establishing a respectful relationship with others through an attitude of openness and curiosity. It's very different from cultural competency, where it's situated where you're the expert and you have all the right answers, whereas humility is framing it as the other person is the expert. And by focusing on humility, it equips you with the right questions to ask and really understand their perspective. So given that my coworker and I didn't have that nonprofit experience and we're new to philanthropy, humility was a really important value in guiding our foundation. And so we saw nonprofits as the experts, because at the start, when we were new to this, all we had was our own intuition and our own internal sense of equity to guide us. And then with curiosity, since we had this beginner's mindset, we approached our philanthropy from a place of learning and exploration and discovery. And we tried to incorporate equity into our philanthropy by really internalizing the feedback that nonprofit leaders had shared with us when we were doing our landscape scan early on in our learning. So we were really transparent with them also about how we needed to grow and where we were constrained. And so we would often ask nonprofits very directly, and they were so generous with us with their responses. What challenges have you experienced with funders? What roles do funders play in your most successful partnerships? And what would you like us to tell other funders? Because we want to ask these questions not only to be good grant makers as we develop our own practice, but we also want to share out the feedback we learned from nonprofits and encourage other funders to be more equitable in their grant making. And third, we also really valued relationship building. So we had heard that often foundations often didn't have enough time to do site visits and had to rely a lot on applications to get to know their grantees, potential grantees. And so we want to get to know nonprofits as individuals rather than as entities. And so we found that nonprofit staff were much more willing to share their visions and their challenges when we met up with them, and we were very open about ourselves and what our capacity was and how we came into this work. And we also found that online research didn't do these organizations justice. So many of them on paper tend to sound very similar in vision, and we really want to learn how they were both unique from each other, but also how they complement each other, because we didn't want to promote this idea of one is better than the other and like promote this sense of competition for scarce resources. So this relationship building was a key part also of our application process, because we would take into account all the detailed notes we took from those meetings and from attending various events, and those would supplement any submitted proposals. And finally, equity via this concept of targeted universalism. So this is a concept that has been spoken and written a lot about by John A. Powell, who's the director of the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley. And it was a way to implement our values that may not necessarily have been in line with the board's values. And it was a way of trying to understand equity. So targeted universalism is essentially this targeted universal strategy where it's inclusive of the needs of both the dominant and the marginal groups, but pays particular attention to the situation of the marginal group. So it's essentially where targeted strategies for universal goals benefit everyone. And it's very similar to the curb cut effect and universal design, where design takes into account disability and it tends to benefit all of society. Next slide. So we integrate these values into our practice of our application process, and many of those practices you can see at equityandphilanthropy.org. This was a resource compiled by Nancy Chan and Pamela Fisher of Arabella Advisors, and many of the examples they list there are ones that we have in our own practice. For example, having the burden of the research process on us, doing that due diligence before we really invest in reaching out to nonprofits. Using the site visits to build a relationship, and streamlining the process in terms of the application. So really asking ourselves, what information do we really need for recommending a grant, and then reflecting even on why is this question a part of our decision making, and whether it's a question just to satisfy our own curiosity, even though it won't necessarily help the grantee. And so another resource that is really valuable is Project Streamline from Peak Grantmaking, formerly known as the Grant Managers Network. And they were a really key resource in implementing a right-sized approach to our grant making. A couple other pieces I want to emphasize is how we accepted proposals and reports submitted to other funders. There's this advice often given to nonprofits to really personalize applications, which is totally understandable. But we also, since we had gotten to know our nonprofits pretty well in person, just through constantly seeing them at various events and community gatherings, we didn't see it as necessary for them to resubmit an entirely new proposal. So we gave them the option of either sending in a 3 to 4 page proposal that answers some of these very basic questions that you might see in a common grant application, but we also gave them the option to submit a proposal that they submitted to other funders, because we saw that as easing the burden on them, so they wouldn't have to spend time on a new application when they could be investing that time into delivering their services. And we saw that as continuing to build trust between us. But I guess one of the limitations might be the information we receive from applicants might not be totally standardized, and some might submit an existing proposal and others might submit a new one. And then finally, also defining their own metrics. So my coworker and I don't come from an evaluation background, and we also applying this concept of humility to our work, we really wanted to ensure that our success aligned with our grantees before deciding how and what we want to measure. So their metrics informed our data collection, and they know what's most effective in their communities, and we didn't want to impose any unrealistic expectations on them, especially when that's not our expertise. But one of the limitations of that is that it might be difficult to measure our success as a foundation in supporting whatever goals we have without having very standardized info. But we still saw it as our mission to serve the grantees and not our own agenda. And with 2 staff of giving small, realistic to have a really rigorous evaluation process, especially if we couldn't provide the funds to do program evaluation. Another component of our practice was providing technical assistance for many first-time foundation grant seekers who need support in proposal development and in their grant writing. And we saw that as helping to build their capacity and help them be more eligible for more funds. Next slide. So some of the results involved just really transformational relationships where we felt like we knew the nonprofits as individuals on both a professional and a personal level, and we could be really open with one another about what our issues were, what our challenges were. So there was a lot more transparency. It also just minimized the frustrations of grant seeking for grantees. We felt like there was a lot of relief from them when we spoke with them about how they didn't have to do this very arduous process in seeking a grant. And there's also a better mutual understanding between the issues our grantees face and what their communities face. And that way we could better support them. And finally, with our focus on equity and really prioritizing certain populations, these underserved, underfunded youth would be supported. Next slide. So some of the lessons we learned from this application process. So I think we did a pretty good job considering we were trying to be very conscientious in engaging with nonprofits, but we did experience some hiccups. So early on when we were in our learning phase, there was a bit of lack of transparency and clarity around our grant making because we were still figuring out what is our structure, what is our process, and we hadn't yet learned how to really manage expectations of nonprofits. And we weren't as well versed in saying no to potential grantees because we were so excited to meet everyone and so engaged by their work and want to support everyone. And we forget about the power and responsibility we held as funders. But over time, as we continue to listen and solicit feedback from them, we grew to be better funder dates, which Pia Infante has written about. Also, financial due diligence, just a very practical thing. We could have benefited from more financial due diligence training early on so that we could identify red flags and make more informed decisions on a few grants. And I think we could have really prioritized the value of courage in trusting our gut instinct about grants that we were unsure about, or proposing a new scope for the grant, or finding partners to help the grantee achieve its goals. And finally, and most importantly, I think, was relationships. So we approached our work, I think, pretty well in terms of building relationships. But we also were very conscious also of how sometimes the grant making process, it involves nonprofits having to distinguish themselves from one another, which is what we had been doing early on when we were just trying to understand the diversity of the field. So we now also ask nonprofit staff in person, courtesy of Taj James from Movement Strategy Center, what is a problem or solution that is big enough and important enough that you can't accomplish it alone? And so Taj spoke about this at Harmony Initiative, and he recommended we not ask nonprofits to distinguish themselves because it promotes this individualism, ownership mentality over the work, but rather who they're in relationship with. And we saw that as a way of really recognizing how this work is very interconnected and interdependent, and that you can't afford to work in isolation if you want to have a large impact and address some of these complex issues. So even though these different organizations might be very unique in their strategy, they all have a very common vision. And so it's a matter of trying to create space to allow these different multiple needs to be expressed, but also different multiple ways to understand the problem and how to address it, and really avoid creating more silos, because that's something that's very common in the nonprofit sphere. So we saw this as a way of encouraging nonprofits to think about not only what they do well, but how other organizations similar to them do their work well, and how they can complement each other, and how their different approaches to the work could leverage everyone's strengths. So that was an overall gist of our application process. I've also included a handout in the webinar if you have any questions or further reading you'd like to do to see what we use to design our application process. A lot of the resources we refer to are there. Thank you.
Thanks, Cassie. Folks, if you're looking for the handout, it should be in your control panel. And it's also something we'll go ahead and put up with the archive when we post the recording and slides online. So now we're going to turn it over to Jake.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Jake Mogan. I'm a program associate with the 11th Hour Project. And if we go ahead and there we go to the first slide, you can see a brief snippet of our vision statement, which will give you a bit of a sense of what the 11th Hour Project is seeking to do with our grant making. We're a program of the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Family Foundation. It's a private family foundation based here in Palo Alto, California. And we employ a systems approach to grant making aimed at challenging existing extractive models of food and energy development in order to create space for alternatives to stand in their place that are built on regenerative models that really emphasize healthy outcomes for communities and the environment. You'll see our 4 core program areas there, which include renewable energy, challenging oil and gas production, an ecological agriculture program that focuses not only on challenging industrial models of food production, but replacing those with regional food systems models that, again, really emphasize healthy and sustainable communities. And finally, we have an international human rights program, which is our newest program, and that really focuses on the intersection of human rights and environmental issues, predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa and Haiti. So if we go to the next slide, as Rachel very eloquently presented at the top of the webinar, I've been a member of the Harmony Initiative second cohort this year. And what the Harmony Initiative has done is really break out the grant making cycle into 6 stages. And really, we spend a day really carefully looking at each stage and identifying, the values and competencies important in each stage to meet the social justice values that we really seek to champion with our grant making, as well as identifying the bad funder habits that occur within each, both within our own institutions and programs, but in the broader field, and identifying solutions to find alignment with the social justice outcomes that we hope to seek and employ. So if you head to the next slide, I'm going to break out that grant cycle into 2 distinct stages, and you'll see a theme throughout my presentation is that it's somewhat artificial to look at these in isolation, that there's a lot of overlap between stages of the grant making cycle. But for today's purposes, I'm going to look specifically at strategy development and look at that through our accompaniment program, which is essentially the time we spend in the fields with our partners. And then at sort of the other end of the cycle, when we're making the case to our board and our leadership, I'm going to discuss how we employ audio-visual grantee videos as a compelling means for presenting the work that we learn about in the field from our partners and presenting that to our board in a compelling way. So if we head to the next slide, I'll start off with our accompaniment program. And we owe both the name and sort of the values behind the program to Paul Farmer from Partners in Health. And essentially, he explained accompaniment as an essential part of establishing and maintaining deep, trusting relationships with partners in the field. As I mentioned, strategy is something in the polished graphic that appears at the beginning of the process, but in reality, it's something that needs to be continually revisited and interrogated. And as 11th Hour has grown and its programs have become more established, accompaniment has evolved from something trying to learn as much as we can to a process where we don't not only try to learn new things, but really examine our existing strategies, our existing assumptions, and really try to ground truth those by being in solidarity and collectivity with our partners in the field, and making sure that the things that we say make sense on paper actually prove out in reality. So if we go to the next program, next slide, I'll just give a basic overview of the program. Essentially, between the months of June and August, all of our staff are encouraged to spend a month in the field, and we submit an application and a draft budget for what that travel will look like in the early spring, and then we discuss that with our leadership, and those plans are approved. And essentially, many foundations emphasize field visits and things like that. I think the one thing that makes Accompaniment unique at 11th Hour is not only the amount of time we spend in the field, but this idea of emphasizing learning and challenging of assumptions rather than simply ensuring grantee accountability and checking in on folks. And challenging assumptions really takes a number of shapes. So that means visiting longer-term partners and making sure that the way we're structuring our partnership and our resources is still beneficial for what they're trying to achieve. Seeking out new partners, making sure that we're knocking on new doors, that we're meeting new groups, and especially those groups that are partnered with our existing partners, making sure that we're truly committed to movement building and really funding and resourcing the entire movement as opposed to just single actors within the movement. And finally, going in with an eye for the tensions that exist in our grantees' work and understanding the role that our resources play in either improving or exacerbating those tensions, and just being very realistic and pragmatic about the fact that there is a funder grantee dynamic, that there are power imbalances, and going in and trying to spend as much time as possible to break those down, and going in with integrity and understanding that there is a level of discomfort, but that by spending time and being very authentic with our time, that we can begin to break those down. And I think I spoke to most of those. And you'll see some pictures on the right side there of examples of things that we've, I'm sorry about that. So you'll see pictures on the right-hand side of the slide there about various accompaniment activities, and those include tours, piloting new projects, and yeah, any number of things in between. So next I'll cover some lessons learned from our accompaniment program. The first is just not overstructuring your time out in the field. I think we've seen so much value that comes from the time in between meetings or the conversations that happen off agenda. So we really try to emphasize not overscheduling your days out in the field, making sure that you really take time to break bread and just be in solidarity. I think what's really great about tours, which is often the shape some accompaniment trips take, is that you have time in the car where it's not you're not indebted to an agenda. You're really just you're understanding what's going on in the grantees' work. You're understanding the context with which they're working in. And there's less pressure, and again, it helps to break down those barriers between funder and grantee. The final thing is just understanding that that we are a burden in many ways when we go out in the field to visit our grantees. That's a given, and just trying to minimize that as much as possible. So as Cassie kind of mentioned, being a good funder date means not being burdensome, really taking care of arrangements, and honestly just making sure you're buying meals as much as possible, because that's a really important part, and it goes a long ways. And grantees who are really working on shoestrings. And finally, really understanding and being true to the purpose of why you're in the field. So I pulled a quote here without necessarily ascribing it to anyone, because I wasn't sure where it came from, but it's something we hold closely here, which is to know and not to act is not to know. So knowing is not enough. Going out and discovering these issues is not enough. You really have to come back, share the lessons learned with your colleagues, and really commit to delivering on the feedback provided by your partners in the field. And we are a little crunched for time, so I'm going to go ahead and skip the grantee video component. But I am happy to follow up with anybody who is interested in how we make the case via videos. and happy to answer any questions at the end of the webinar. Thank you so much.
Great. And Jake, if it's okay with you, we can explore getting those videos up on the archive too. So we can hopefully get those to you guys on the call through a couple different channels.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, Jazmin, we'd love to welcome you to share your story. Oops. 1 second, I think you're on mute. All right, I think you're good to go.
Oh, great. Thanks, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jazmin Segura. I'm with the San Francisco Foundation, and I'll be providing a just quick overview of our new equity agenda, and I'll share a little bit more about the process for how we came about launching the rapid response for movement building. So if we can go to the next slide. The San Francisco Foundation is a community foundation, and we serve 5 Bay Area counties. We were structured within 5 different program areas, but I will just dive deep into how we landed in our People, Place, Power pathways, and that's a little bit of context for the Rapid Response Fund. So throughout history, the San Francisco Foundation has been firmly committed to the residents of the region. However, in the last couple of years, we have found ourselves at a crossroads, and at the same time that the region has experienced a lot of growth and increase in wealth, we have also seen a widening gap in terms of income inequality, wealth inequality, and basically we're seeing that the rising tide has not lifted all boats. This is especially true for people working low-wage jobs, and people of color, immigrants, a lot of the most marginalized communities, members of our communities. In 2006, we reached out and connected with community and civic businesses, a lot of our community leaders. We also reached out to the private sector across the region. And what we heard over and over again was that people of color, low-income, low-wage workers were having a really, really hard time and were being displaced from a region and the areas that they called home. In July, we announced a deepening commitment to expanding opportunities and inclusion for these communities that we deeply care about. We have always had a regional footprint, but now we were having a regional agenda, and our grant making was sort of going to be looking at our work through a regional lens. We have always been committed to social justice, and now we were building upon that history and our agenda to advance greater racial and economic equity. So across the region now, we need to ensure that everyone has a chance to get a good job, to live in a safe and affordable home, and that everyone has a strong political voice and can live in the county, in the communities that they grew up in. And so our programmatic work now includes is structured in these 3 different pathways, which are people, place, and power. Within the power team, we recognized that Bay Area residents needed to build power to ensure a strong political and community voice. The vision here was that all residents should be at the forefront of leading change, that residents in the Bay Area and those who are most directly impacted by our systems inequities should be at the forefront of developing system solutions, and that they should have the agency to decide what's best for themselves and their families and for their communities. So as we were exploring new funding opportunities that embody our values and that really move forward this vision, we were also at the same time hearing about the fear and anxiety that was showing up in our communities in the weeks leading up to the election. Next slide. The anti-immigrant rhetoric and Islamophobia became sort of a new reality and a frightening one for a lot of our communities that were directly impacted by the rhetoric that was being sort of used during the presidential election. I dare to say that the outcome of the election was really a call to action for many of us, and it was no different for the San Francisco Foundation. It was clear to us that in times of rapid change, we really needed a mechanism for rapid response. It was also clear that this was not a time for us to do business as usual, and that our equity strategy, we had a long-term vision and a long-term plan for the community that we wanted to see in the next 5 years and 10 years that we were sort of like structuring that, we also realized that we needed to respond to and stand with the communities that we care. So that is one of the reasons why we launched the Rapid Response Fund. This is a new funding approach for the foundation, and the idea was to deploy fast resources to organizations and community leaders that are in the front lines of community organizing and organizing specifically around racial justice and civil rights issues. The Rapid Response Fund provides grants in the range of $3,000 and $15,000, and it recognizes that communities need timely resources to respond to the issues at in real time. We're committed to processing these grants in less than 30 days, and so far we've sort of been able to average our processing time between 2 and 3 weeks. We sort of do that, so we've been able to average that and meet the demands of the community. We've also been able to, or through the Rapid Response, we really understand that these events, there's a lot of things that are not being planned. There's a lot of executive orders that are being signed on a weekly basis, and a lot of communities that are facing violence, a lot of issues happening in the Bay Area. So we really understand the urgency and the unprecedented nature of a lot of these events. And so we don't have a deadline for a Rapid Response Fund. We process these grants on a weekly basis. And again, it's really to recognize the unprecedented nature of both the political climate that we live in right now and the issues that are happening in the Bay Area. And then thirdly, the fund is also intended to support much smaller grassroots organizations, fiscally sponsored projects that may not have access to traditional philanthropic resources. I have to say that from the over 100 applications that we've received so far, 2/3 of those are coming from organizations that have less than $1 million in terms of their budget size. So next slide. Up to date, we've reviewed close to 120 applications. We've been able to provide a little bit over $400,000 in funding since we launched the program in November. Next slide. And I just wanted to give you a sense of the proposals that we've been able to support through the Rapid Response Fund. About 71% of the proposals that were granted are dealing with immigration issues. So we've received a lot of proposals that are centered on immigrant rights, particularly around the protection and deportation defense of immigrant communities through Know Your Rights presentations, family preparedness plans that are, sort of preparing immigrant families of what to do and where to leave their children in case of an immigration deportation. The next set of grants are also centered around issues of civil rights and civil liberties to really address the Islamophobia and challenge the increased bullying and hate crimes against the MEMSA community. And it's no surprising that sort of in the last couple of weeks, we've also seen an increased demand for mental health services and other healing practices to really address the anxiety and depression and trauma that's been triggered by the political climate, as well as a lot of LGBTQ organizations that are coming in also feeling the brunt of the anxiety and a lot of issues that are being triggered by our current political climate. So next slide. I wanted to, so this is just a picture of one of our grantees, and I know we're running out of time, but this is one of the projects we've been able to support. And this is really a youth-led organization of formerly undocumented or currently undocumented folks that are doing train-the-trainer Know Your Rights presentations going out to the Bay Area and providing a lot of the support from themselves who are directly impacted and taking leadership and ownership and approaching this new reality for them from a place of power and feeling like they have a strong voice and that they are best suited to really bring about this community awareness within their neighborhoods, within their communities, their counties, and their regions. So I think we've been able to do some amazing work, and this is a picture from the California Immigrant Youth Justice Alliance that's been doing this work across the region. Next slide. So some key takeaways from the Rapid Response Fund. Rachel really asked me to talk about like what was hard about launching this response, and honestly, I feel that it was somewhat, the timing was perfect for us. So as I mentioned, we were moving forward in this new strategic direction, and we were exploring new funding opportunities. The fact that we have stated very clearly that we're supported to building community organizing, coalition building, and that we want to support the leadership of directly impacted communities, it was not that difficult to make the case for the Rapid Response Fund. What was kind of more difficult was in trying to figure out what were the resources and the staffing necessary that needed to be in place within our internal structure to make sure that we were responding to these proposals on a timely basis. I have here just a few things that I wanted to highlight about the Rapid Response Fund. In terms of criteria, really being not too broad and not too narrow, the ability to be nimble and light in terms of the process was really key for us. I think had we had a much more narrow set of guidelines, I think we would have failed to take advantage of the unpredictability and fluidity of our political environment. There's been, we've been able to provide small grants, and not all organizations required or requested the $15,000, which was our max grant, but we've been able to both meet the needs in a very timely basis. Also, again, I mentioned part of our criteria was these are unplanned activities, these are unforeseen opportunities, so being able to highlight those in your application process has been very helpful for us to distinguish from core operating, ongoing programmatic support, and the need to respond to a current event or a current change in the work that you're doing. Again, I mentioned the process must be nimble and user-friendly for all parties. We were able to we had to do a lot of internal education of why it was important for us to have a very simple application, why we didn't need to ask for organizational budgets and audits that really defeated the purpose of a Rapid Response Fund, that we really just wanted to have the basic information that was going to help us make the decision making internally, but that we didn't want to put a burden on the organizations who were applying for a $5,000 grant. And also this has been an opportunity for us to be in relationship with new grantees. About 40% of the grantees that have come in through the Rapid Response Fund are new to the foundation. So this has been, we've been able to really take advantage of this exploratory opportunity of the Rapid Response Fund. So again, this is kind of it has shifted of culture to an ongoing learning opportunities here within the foundation. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm happy to talk to any of you if you're interested in exploring this potential funding opportunity within your own foundations.
Thank you so much, Jazmin, and to all of you. I know we could probably spend at least an hour on each of these case studies, so everybody on the webinar is getting a bit of sort of that concentrated dose of information. And as we're on the hour, I just wanted to highlight just 3 tensions that I heard from the presentations, and then we'll have those who can stay. We'll have time for a few questions. But Cassie, I was really struck by in your story that tension between being guided by the value of curiosity and where you caught yourselves on what kinds of information you really needed and you were really going to use, as opposed to just satisfying your own curiosity. So I'm thinking about when your values led, that it's an art, not a science. Similarly, I heard a tension, Jake, in your example around the importance of taking time to develop really authentic relationships through the accompaniment program to be able to navigate the inherent power dynamic with grantees. But at the same time, you have this value of and goal to not be burdensome on grantees. And so that tension of how trust building takes time, and we don't want to be taking too much of our grantees' times. And then Jazmin, I heard some of that tension in your example about being an organization that's really guided by this long-term vision, then how do you pivot to be responsive to a short-term need? As you said, the timing was great given the new strategic direction of the foundation, but also you have a well-established bureaucracy of a large community foundation to be able to pivot and process a rapid response fund to be able to get grants out in 2 to 3 weeks. That's pretty phenomenal. So just to name, we build this as having pulling out some of the tension. So I just wanted to share those, and we'd love to, for those who have the time and interest, hear whatever questions you might have.
Thanks, Rachel. Absolutely, we have some questions coming in. I'm going to start to read them back to the group, and would love to hear from the speakers. I know we are on the hour, so if folks need to step away, we understand, and we encourage you to check out the archive to get answers to questions. We're going to just take a couple more minutes on the line here, if you are able to stay. Couple of questions specifically for you, Jazmin, and then I have some questions for the larger group. First question about rapid response funding is, were you accepting applications as they came in, or did you set deadlines? And if you set deadlines, what was the schedule like?
We didn't set deadlines for the organizations, though we made it very clear that we were going to take up to 30 days to get back to the organizations. What we did do is set deadlines for ourselves internally. So there's a whole systems approach that we did. So we receive applications like every Friday. We have one of our program assistants print out the copies for us or give us the application that's in PDF form. We also decided not to have the application be part of our internal sort of grantee center, which is the system that we usually use for all of our other grant making approaches. We wanted to make, again, the application very accessible to the organization. So every Friday we get those in our inbox, and we have 1 week turnaround to review and provide our scorings. We have a weekly meeting also with the selection committee. So while the organizations externally do not have any deadline, we are reviewing those on a weekly basis internally.
Great. And in terms of that application and the process of managing the grants, for the grantees in your Rapid Response Fund, what kind of requirements were made of them, and what forms of reporting or indicators are a part of those requirements?
The requirements are just, they're filling out the PDF application, which has about four questions. And then we also ask them to submit a project budget so that we get a better sense of what they're going to be using these specific funds for. We ask for the organizational budget. Just there's a line item where they say like what's their budget size, but we don't ask for organizational budget. And then obviously we need to verify if they do have a fiscal sponsor. Then we'll have the information for the fiscal sponsor. I think what was like, and that's about it. We don't ask for anything else. The questions that we ask are, what's the short purpose of this project? What's the potential for impact, for immediate impact? And it has to be a project that's time sensitive. So it has to be done within 6 months, 12 months, 9 months. We left it somewhat vague for that because, again, this was sort of a moment of exploration for ourselves. And we're also asking, how are directly impacted communities involved in the decision making or in developing the project? That was very key for us to know how are the communities at large involved in this project. We certainly did not want to fund kind of intermediary organizations that felt that they knew best what was needed for the community at the moment. So we've been able to make our decisions based on that. If we do have any follow-up questions or we need a little bit more clarity about any of those answers, then we, just kind of give them a call when we have a better sense of what their project is, and that's what we used to do our final recommendation. But we don't ask them to submit any additional written information for ourselves. Okay,
great, thank you. For folks on the call who stayed for question and answer, if you have more questions, you can continue to type them in. I think we're actually going to just post one more to the panel in the spirit of staying as close to time as we can and trying to respect how much you guys have already offered in your wonderful presentations. The first, the question I have is about kind of position with an organization. And it sounds like each of you is in a little bit of a different kind of organization with a little bit different staff structure. But for folks who are maybe newer to their foundations or their organizations or in kind of mid-level decision making, do you have tips for folks on how to push forward or advocate for these kinds of processes and analyses inside their institutions, things that you learned about the approval process in your institutions that can help folks turn it back into something practical where they work?
This is Rachel. I can jump
Cassie.
in, but I'd like, no, go ahead, Cassie. Yeah, I'd rather have you guys answer.
I guess, well, I came from a really small foundation. I was one of 2 staff, and then we had our really small board. And I think that helped in big part, but I think also was ensuring that my coworker and I were in alignment on values, because my coworker had worked with the board president for 20-something years. So she was very familiar with their communication and leadership style. And if I was able to find common ground with her and really connect with her, and if we were both on the same page, then it was a lot easier for us to move our equity agenda forward on the board front. So I guess what I would recommend is like finding allies within your institution and then bringing that forward to senior leadership.
Great, thank you.
I would just add, this is Jazmin. What was really exciting about the Rapid Response Fund was showing what could be done differently at the foundation. It is a very structured institution, and so we get to hear a lot of the "we've always done it this way" approach, and so being able to have a sample of just like what it could look like if we do it differently, rather than just saying this is not the best way or the most effective. I think just kind of taking it upon yourselves and take some leadership and providing and just mapping it out or visualize it so that you can, so that they have something to respond to. And it was a great opportunity for us to do that at this moment in time, and it worked. So it was really helpful for us that we were going through a strategic planning process, but we also were able to take advantage of the opportunity at hand. I think being very ready for that.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing is that oftentimes one of the negative things about philanthropy is that there's this groupthink or herd mentality aspect, and I think sometimes that can be negative, but it can also be very positive when you can identify practices and values and approaches from funders that are really sort of breaking out of these, the conventional molds of grant making. And so I would encourage you to really, be proactive in reaching out to funder colleagues at other institutions, identifying those that, do things in a certain way that you think would be really helpful for your own institution, and then just inviting them to present to your board or your senior leadership or whoever will listen, because I think often it's uncomfortable to go out and try something new that seemingly hasn't been done before. But if you can see a model at another institution that's proved successful, then that I think will only help to encourage your board and your leadership to try to take a risk and implement something new.
Great, thank you. I am going to go ahead and close, even though we still have some questions coming in. I'm going to try and get those answered offline, but I want to do the best we can to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much to Rachel, to Cassie, to Jake, to Jazmin. Thank you to everyone who signed up for today's webinar and has attended. This has been, as you said, Rachel, a really rich conversation. You guys did a lot of wonderful work to help us see practical implementation and some awesome theory behind the practice. So I'm really grateful. I learned something today. We're absolutely going to have this up online. If you have questions, you can, again, email me at biz@epip.org. So hopefully I can help you out. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you guys on the next webinar, and hopefully continuing to collaborate with all of our wonderful speakers today. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, everyone.